Wyoming Territory, August 1876. The sun was a hammer on the high plains, beating the dust into a fine, choking powder. Around the fresh-laid foundation of his new cabin, Elias Thorne was not building up. He was digging down. But he was not digging a root cellar, nor was he sinking supports for a porch. He was carving a trench into the earth, a shallow channel no wider than a man's boot. It did not run straight. It began at the far corner of his small plot and curved inward, a slow, deliberate spiral that coiled tighter and tighter until it disappeared beneath the spot where his cabin floor would one day lie. Men riding past on their way to the trading post would rein in their horses. They would watch the solitary figure, his back bent, his shovel moving with a steady, rhythmic grace that seemed alien to the frantic energy of the frontier. They saw the strange, curling ditch and saw no sense in it. "What's Thorne about now?" one would ask another. "Digging a snake hole," the other might reply, a smirk playing on his lips. Or maybe he plans to drown his own foundation come the spring thaw. The whispers grew into open questions, and the questions curdled into mockery. Elias Thorne, the quiet Norwegian with shipwright's hands and an unreadable calmness in his eyes, was carving a fool's pattern into the unforgiving Wyoming dirt. He offered no explanations. He simply kept digging. What did this man, this outsider who knew the sea but not the plains, understand about the nature of cold that a generation of seasoned trappers and frontiersmen had missed? What secret was he burying in the earth? A secret that would be dismissed as madness until the deadliest winter in living memory came to test it? If you want to understand the simple physics that can mean the difference between life and death, subscribe to this channel and stay with me. The answer is not in the wood, but in the air itself. To understand the genius of what the settlers called Thorne's folly, you must first understand the enemy. The enemy was winter, not the gentle, not the gentle, snow-dusted winter of Christmas cards, but the raw, elemental cold of the American West. It was a predator. It stalked the plains from November to April, a silent, killing presence that seeped through the thickest logs and stole the breath from sleeping children. The settlers fought it with the only weapons they had: fire and wood. The standard cabin of the territory was a fortress of logs, chinked with mud and moss, its windows small, its door heavy. At its heart stood a cast-iron stove, a hungry god that demanded constant tribute. A family's life was measured in cords of wood, stacked high against the autumn sky. The sound of winter was the ceaseless ring of an axe, a desperate percussion against the encroaching silence. But it was a losing battle. The conventional wisdom was fundamentally flawed. A cabin, no matter how well built, was a box full of holes. The very fire meant to keep a family warm was its greatest vulnerability. To breathe, a fire needs air. The hungrier the fire, the more air it consumes. This created a relentless, invisible engine of cold. The stove would draw in air from every crack, every seam, every gap in the chinking. It pulled drafts across the floor that were cold enough to numb a man's feet. These were not gentle breezes. They were miniature rivers of Arctic air flowing constantly into the house. A settler could be sweating on one side, facing the stove, while his back felt the icy touch of a Wyoming gale. The result was a brutal, inefficient cycle. A man would spend all day chopping wood to feed a fire that was actively pulling the very cold he was trying to fight into his home. The heat rose, pooling uselessly against the ceiling, while the life-giving warmth at floor level was stolen by the stove's insatiable appetite. Families would burn through a winter supply of wood by February, forced to desperate measures. They burned furniture. They burned fence posts. They burned the very wood intended for next year's expansion. The air inside these cabins grew thick with smoke and desperation. Frost would form on the inside of the walls, a beautiful, deadly lacework of ice. A cup of water left on a table overnight would be a solid block by morning. Ink froze in its wells. Beards grew a rime of crystallized breath. This was the reality every settler faced. It was a known hardship, an accepted part of the bargain they had made with the land. They built thicker walls. They stuffed more moss in the cracks. They built bigger fires. They fought the symptoms because they did not understand the disease. Elias Thorne understood. His knowledge came not from the forest, but from the sea. For 20 years, he had been a shipwright in Bergen, Norway. He had built wooden vessels designed to sail the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. A ship's hull was a world unto itself, a sealed environment battling constant, penetrating damp and cold. On a ship, uncontrolled airflow was a harbinger of death. It brought moisture. Moisture brought rot. Rot brought structural failure hundreds of miles from land. A shipwright did not just work with wood, he worked with air. He learned to manage its flow, to channel it, to make it work for the vessel, not against it. He understood that you could not defeat the air. You had to persuade it. When Elias looked at a Wyoming cabin, he did not see a fortress. He saw a poorly designed lung. He saw a system that was fighting itself, wasting monumental effort for meager returns. He saw men trying to heat a home by opening a door to the Arctic. He knew there was another way. His way would not fight the cold, it would tame it. It would make the earth itself a partner in survival. His solution began with that strange, spiraling trench. After digging the channel nearly 100 feet in its long, curving path, he lined it with flat, carefully placed river stones. He then capped the entire channel with more stones, creating a long, hollow tube beneath the earth, a stone serpent coiling towards the cabin's center. This was the artery. He laid his floor joists directly over this, leaving a gap in the very middle of the floor plan. Here, directly above where the stone channel terminated, he would place his stove. The cabin he built atop this foundation was different too. It was a double-walled structure, an inner wall of planed logs and an outer wall of rough-sawn timber with a 3-inch gap between them. He painstakingly filled this gap with dried moss and sawdust, a thick layer of insulation that baffled his neighbors. It was a colossal amount of extra work. "You're building a box inside a box," one man noted, shaking his head. "Wasting good wood that could build a shed." Elias merely nodded, his hands never ceasing their work. He was not just building walls, he was creating a shell, a barrier against the conductive heat loss that plagued every other home in the valley. It was the work beneath the floor, however, that drew the most attention. One afternoon, as Elias was fitting the subfloor, Silas Croft arrived. Croft was the region's most respected builder. He was a man whose cabins were known to be the tightest, warmest, and strongest in 3 counties. He had built the trading post, the church, the homes of the valley's most prosperous ranchers. His approval was a seal of quality. His skepticism was a death sentence for any new idea. Croft stood for a long time, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of Thorne's bizarre foundation. He walked the perimeter, looked at the double walls, and then knelt, peering into the open end of the stone-lined trench where it began near the edge of the property. He grunted, a low sound of disapproval. "Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the weight of undisputed authority. "What is the purpose of this ditch?" "It is for the stove," Elias replied simply, not pausing in his work. Croft's brow furrowed. He was a practical man who dealt in the known quantities of wood, stone, and iron. This talk of a ditch for a stove made no sense. A stove needs a chimney for smoke, not a tunnel for snakes. "It is the stove's breath," Elias said, finally looking up. His gaze was steady, without challenge. Silas Croft was not a man given to flights of fancy. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the trench. "Let me tell you what will happen. The ground holds moisture. When the freeze comes, the air in that pipe of yours will condense. Water will pool at the lowest point. By January, you will have a solid river of ice under your floor." He stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. His voice grew louder, taking on the tone of a lecturer. "That ice will heave the ground and crack your foundation stones. But worse, the damp will rise. It will creep into your floor joists and it will rot your cabin from the bottom up. I have seen it happen a dozen times with poorly dug cellars. You are inviting the damp right into the heart of your home." It was a sound argument. It was based on years of hard-won experience. The other men who had gathered to watch the exchange nodded in agreement. Croft's logic was impeccable. Wood and constant damp were mortal enemies. Elias Thorne listened patiently. When Croft was finished, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The air will move," he said. "It will stay dry." Croft let out a short, sharp laugh of disbelief. "It will move, all right. It will move frost and rot into your timbers. You are building a trap for yourself, man." He turned and walked away. His verdict delivered. The other men dispersed, shaking their heads. From that day on, the project had a name. It was whispered at the trading post and spoken openly over mugs of coffee. They called it the Snail House. It was a name born of mockery, a perfect description for the slow, spiraling madness of the newcomer. Elias Thorne ignored it all. He finished the floor, installed the heavy cast iron stove directly over the central intake, and sealed the cabin. From the outside, it looked much like any other, albeit more meticulously constructed. But beneath the floor, the secret engine lay in wait. The physics of it were profoundly simple, yet completely alien to the frontier mindset. The settlers saw the stove as a source of heat. Elias saw it as an engine of airflow. When his stove was lit, the rising heat of the fire and the smoke leaving the chimney would create a powerful and continuous vacuum. This was the draw. In a normal cabin, that draw was satisfied by pulling in freezing air from 100 tiny cracks. But Thorne's cabin was different. It was sealed. The double insulated walls were nearly airtight. There were no drafts for the stove to draw upon. There was only one source of intake air available to it, the mouth of the long, stone-lined tunnel that began 100 feet away from the cabin. This was the core of his design. The stove was forced to pull its breath through that long, subterranean spiral. The air that entered the tunnel would be the same brutally cold air of the Wyoming winter. But as it traveled along the 100-foot path buried 3 feet underground, it would be warmed. The earth itself acted as a massive heat exchanger. Even under a deep freeze, the ground temperature several feet down remains remarkably stable, holding at a temperature well above freezing, typically between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The Arctic air, entering the tunnel at perhaps 20 below zero, would have no choice but to surrender its killing cold to the warmer stone walls of the channel. By the time the air finished its long, slow journey and emerged from the vent beneath Elias's stove, it would no longer be a weapon of the winter. It would be pre-warmed, mild, and gentle. The stove would not be fighting a gale of minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit air. It would be fed a steady diet of 45 degrees Fahrenheit air. This transformed the entire equation of survival. The stove could burn far more efficiently, using less fuel to achieve a higher temperature. Because the air intake was a single, controlled point, there were no drafts. The warm air produced by the stove could now fill the entire cabin, from floor to ceiling, without being disturbed or stolen. The cabin did not just get warm, it stayed warm. The system was a lung, breathing in time with the fire. Silas Croft's prediction of condensation and ice was logical, but it missed one critical variable: the constant, steady flow. The stove's draw was relentless. The air never had a chance to become stagnant, to cool, to release its moisture. It was always moving, a dry, warming river flowing invisibly beneath the floor. Elias had not invited the damp into his home. He had created a system that actively expelled it. He had built an engine powered by the earth and the fire, a machine for living. November came with a hard frost that did not relent. The days grew short. The sky, a sheet of pewter. The first snows fell, thin and dry. By early December, the valley was locked in the grip of a cold that felt different. It was a deeper, more penetrating cold than usual. The old-timers felt it in their bones and looked to the sky with unease. The real test began on the third week of December. A blizzard swept down from the north, a wall of white that erased the world for 2 days. When it finally passed, it left behind a profound, deathly stillness. And then the temperature began to drop. It was not a gradual cooling, it was a plunge. The thermometer at the trading post, a trusted instrument for a decade, seemed to be broken. At dawn on the first clear day, it read -10 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset, it was -22. The following morning, the mercury was huddled at the bottom of the glass at -34 degrees. It was a cold that had no precedent. It was a cold that felt like the end of the world. The valley hunkered down. Life contracted to the small circle of warmth around the iron stoves. The sound of axes became frantic, then sporadic, as men dared not venture far from their homes. The suffering began almost immediately. In cabins built to the highest frontier standard, the cold laid siege. The chinking between the logs, hardened by the frost, cracked and fell away, opening up new avenues for the Arctic air. The drafts across the floors were no longer just a nuisance, they were a threat. Children were bundled in every blanket they owned and kept on tables or in their parents' beds, away from the killing cold that pooled at their feet. The consumption of wood was terrifying. Families who thought they had enough fuel for 2 winters watched their wood piles vanish in a matter of days. The stoves, drawing in the super-dense, -30 degrees Fahrenheit air, had to be run at full blast just to keep the indoor temperature above freezing. They glowed a dull, menacing red, devouring split logs in a constant, hungry roar. Livestock in the barns began to die, frozen solid in their stalls. Men made desperate, dangerous runs to their woodlots, returning with faces blistered by frostbite. The community, once bound by shared hardship, was atomized by it. Each family was an island, locked in a solitary battle for survival. Silas Croft, the master builder, found himself in a state of quiet panic. His own cabin, the pinnacle of his craft, was failing. He had chinked it himself just last fall. His foundation was deep, his roof was tight, yet a thick armor of frost coated his interior walls. He had hung blankets over the door and windows, but the cold still found its way in. His wife and 2 young sons lived in a small huddle around their magnificent stove, the largest model available from the East. Silas fed it constantly, his hands raw from handling the frozen wood. He had already burned through a full cord of his best seasoned oak, a supply that should have lasted him a month. The temperature inside his home barely reached 45 degrees. The cold was winning. His expertise, his reputation, his lifetime of knowledge, it was all useless against this elemental onslaught. In the deepest, coldest hours of the third night, as he sat watching the stove, a thought crept into his mind. It was a thought he had dismissed 100 times. The snail house, Thorn's Folly. He pictured the Norwegian and his family sealed inside that strange, double-walled box with its foolish underground pipe. A grim certainty settled over him. They were likely dead. A cabin built on such a flawed principle, inviting the damp and the frost into its very bones, would have become a tomb of ice. Croft's prediction about the frozen trench would have come true with a vengeance. He felt a pang of guilt. He had mocked the man, but he had not intervened. He had allowed a man's pride to lead his family to their doom. The thought gnawed at him through the night. By morning, with the outside temperature holding at a terrifying -32 degrees, he could bear it no longer. It was a matter of duty, of basic human decency. He had to go and see. He had to know what had become of the Thorne family. He told his wife he was checking the livestock, a lie to spare her the worry. The journey to Thorne's cabin was an ordeal. It was only half a mile, but the air was so cold it burned his lungs. Each breath was a physical effort. The snow was deep and dry, squeaking under his boots with a sound like tearing cloth. The world was rendered in shades of white and gray, the sun a pale, powerless wafer in the sky. He pulled his scarf up over his nose, but the moisture from his breath instantly froze the fabric into a stiff, icy mask. As he approached the cabin, he saw no signs of life. There was no column of thick, churning smoke pouring from the chimney, the kind he saw from every other struggling homestead. Instead, a thin, almost invisible wisp of heat shimmered into the air. A bad sign. It meant a low, dying fire, one that had lost its battle with the cold. His heart sank. He was too late. He steeled himself for what he might find inside and knocked on the heavy wooden door. The sound was flat and dead in the frozen air. He waited. He heard a faint sound from within, a scraping of a chair, and then the bar on the door was lifted. The door swung inward, and Silas Croft was hit by a physical force. It was not a sound, not a sight. It was a wave of warmth. It was a dense, impossible, life-giving heat that washed over his frozen face and hands, so shocking in its contrast to the outside world that he staggered back a step. He blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust. Elias Thorne stood in the doorway. He was not wearing a heavy coat or a hat. He was in his shirt sleeves. Behind him, in the warm, gentle light of the cabin, Croft saw a scene of such profound and unbelievable domestic normalcy that his mind refused to process it. Thorne's wife, Alara, was at a table near the stove, kneading dough for bread, her own sleeves rolled up past her elbows. There was a light sheen of perspiration on her brow. On the wooden floor, the two Thorne children were playing with carved wooden animals. They were barefoot, in the middle of the great freeze. Silas Croft's gaze darted around the room, searching for the expected signs of hardship. There were none. The single-pane windows were clear of frost. There was no rime on the interior walls. A pot of something that smelled like stew simmered gently on the stove, its steam rising in a lazy curl. The air was warm and fresh, not smoky or stagnant. It felt like a cabin in late September, not one at the mercy of a polar vortex. He stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind him, and the brutal cold of the outside world vanished as if it had never existed. He stood there speechless, his own heavy winter coat suddenly absurdly hot. He fumbled to unbutton it. "Silas," Elias said, his voice calm, "it is good you are here. Come in from the cold." The words were so simple, yet they carried the weight of an undeniable, world-altering truth. Croft, the expert, the master builder, could only stare. His mind, a thing of straight lines and right angles, was struggling to comprehend this impossible reality. He began to investigate, his builder's instincts taking over. He walked to the north wall, the one that faced the killing wind. In his own cabin, that wall was a sheet of ice. He pressed his bare palm against the smooth-planed logs. It was cool, but it was only cool. It was dry and solid. He looked at the stove. It was burning with a low, steady flame, not the roaring inferno that was consuming his own woodpile. He walked over to the wood box beside it. He had expected to see it empty or filled with splintered furniture. It was 3/4 full of neatly split seasoned pine. This was the detail that finally broke through his disbelief. The fuel, the source of all life in winter. He turned to Elias, his voice a hoarse whisper. "How much wood have you burned, Thorn, since the blizzard began?" Elias considered for a moment. "1/4 of a cord," he said. "Perhaps a little less." The numbers landed on Silas Croft like a physical blow. 1/4 of a cord. He, Silas, had burned through more than a full cord, 4 times as much, and had achieved only a miserable, life-threatening chill. Thorn had used a fraction of the fuel to create a paradise of warmth. Croft's eyes fell upon a thermometer hanging on a wall away from the stove. He walked over to it, his boots heavy on the warm floorboards. He squinted at the small glass tube. The red line stood steady and clear. It read 68 degrees. 68 degrees? Outside it was 32 degrees below zero. A 100-degree difference maintained with a small, quiet fire. The numbers were not just undeniable, they were revolutionary. Elias seemed to understand what was happening in the other man's mind. He gestured towards the base of the stove, where a small grated vent sat flush with the floor. "The breath," he said. Silas knelt, his knees protesting the movement. He cautiously held his hand over the vent. He expected to feel a draft of icy air, the source of the cold that his own stove pulled in. Instead, he felt a gentle, steady, and inexplicably mild current of air flowing into the room. It was not warm, but it was not cold. It was neutral. It was the temperature of a spring cellar. It was the pre-warmed air from the earth. In that moment, standing in the impossible warmth of the snail house, Silas Croft understood. He saw the whole system in his mind's eye, the long, coiling tunnel, the heat exchange with the earth, the sealed walls, the single controlled breath for the fire. He saw how his own prediction of a frozen, damp-filled trench was so completely and utterly wrong because he had failed to account for the constant flow of air that kept the system dry and alive. He rose to his feet, a slow, heavy movement. He looked at Elias Thorn, at this quiet man he had dismissed as a fool. He saw not madness, but a depth of understanding that dwarfed his own. Shame and awe warred within him. "I was wrong," Silas Croft said. His voice was clear and steady, stripped of all its former arrogance. It was the simple, unadorned confession of a man whose entire worldview had been shattered and rebuilt in the space of 10 minutes. "I was completely wrong." He took a breath of the warm, clean air. "Thorn," he said, the name now a mark of deep respect. "You have to show me. You have to show me how this works." When the great freeze of '77 finally broke, it left a trail of devastation across the territory. Families emerged from their homes, gaunt and exhausted. The losses were heavy. Livestock decimated, timber supplies exhausted, people sickened by the long confinement in smoky, frigid cabins. The winter had taken its toll, but one story spread through the valley like a wildfire in a dry season. It was the story of the Thorn Cabin. It was told first by Silas Croft, whose word was law in matters of construction. He told it without shame, with the zeal of a convert. He described the barefoot children, the warm walls, the full wood box. He explained the principle of the breathing floor, the genius of the earth-warmed air intake, the mockery surrounding the snail house, evaporated overnight. The name remained, but its meaning was inverted. It was no longer an insult. It was a badge of honor, a term for a revolutionary new way of thinking. Men who had laughed at Elias now came to his cabin, hats in hand. They came not to mock, but to learn. Elias Thorn, a man who had never sought the spotlight, found himself at the center of his community. He was patient and generous with his knowledge. He drew diagrams in the dirt, explaining the principles of airflow and geothermal exchange. He did not lecture, he demonstrated. He showed them how to calculate the length of the intake tunnel based on the size of the cabin, how to lay the stones to ensure a smooth, unimpeded flow. The next spring, a new sound was heard across the valley. It was the sound of shovels digging trenches, not for foundations, but for the arteries of a new kind of home. Silas Croft, the former skeptic, became the innovation's most important champion. He put his reputation and his skill behind Thorne's method. He helped his neighbors retrofit their existing cabins, digging the spiraling channels and sealing the walls for a proper draw. For new constructions, the Thorne method became the undisputed standard. Cabins built in the years that followed were fundamentally different. They were warmer, safer, and vastly more efficient. The change was visible in the autumn sky. The wood piles, once monumental symbols of a family's wealth and security, became smaller, more modest. A third of the wood now did the work that had once required a full supply. The transformation of the community was profound. The winter, once a mortal enemy to be endured, became simply a season to be managed. The terror of running out of fuel receded. The health of the community improved, with fewer cases of the lung ailments that came from living in cold, damp, smoky air. The real impact was not measured in cords of wood saved or degrees of temperature gained. It was measured in human lives. It was measured in the infant who survived its first winter without the constant threat of a fatal chill. It was measured in the elderly couple who could move about their home freely, without being tethered to the stove. It was measured in the simple, sentient, priceless dignity of a family living in warmth and security, no longer prisoners in their own home. Elias Thorne never sought fame or fortune for his idea. He remained the quiet shipwright, a man who solved a problem because it needed solving. His satisfaction came from seeing his neighbors safe, from the quiet nod of thanks from a man whose family had survived the winter in comfort for the first time. His name became synonymous with the design, a quiet legacy etched not in stone, but in the very breath of the homes that kept his community alive. The story of the snail house is more than a tale of frontier ingenuity. It is a lesson in the arrogance of conventional wisdom and the power of looking at an old problem from a new perspective. The settlers of Wyoming were not foolish. They were following generations of hard-won knowledge. But it was a knowledge that had reached its limits. It took an outsider, a man whose experience was forged in a different world, to see the invisible forces at play, to see the air not as an enemy to be blocked, but as a medium to be controlled and conditioned. Elias Thorne understood that the greatest source of warmth was not the fire in his stove, but the massive, stable thermal battery of the earth beneath his feet. He simply built a way to use it. This principle of using the Earth's constant temperature to precondition air is not a forgotten piece of history. It is the very foundation of modern geothermal heating and cooling systems, and the core concept behind the heat recovery ventilators found in today's most energy-efficient buildings. The tools have changed, but the physics have not. If this story of how simple, elegant engineering can triumph over brute force changed how you think about the world around you, hit that like button. And subscribe for more stories of the forgotten wisdom that built our world. We have to ask, what other simple, what powerful solutions are hiding in plain sight, just waiting for someone to look at the problem differently? This narrative is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering principles of earth-sheltered construction and passive air intake systems are real and historically documented, the characters, specific events, and locations depicted in this story are products of imagination. This content does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.